With all of these protests and everything going on, there's been lots of calls for the removal of statues. There's, even in Minnesota, some protesters did take down the statue of Christopher Columbus. And
right.
So I think one of my first questions is why, this might sound crazy, but why do we even have them? Why do we have statues of people up?
Well, it's a great question. The thing is that, these are such interesting questions, as they're very much a thing of the past, particularly classical styled monuments where it's a figure on a pedestal. The equestrian statue, the man on a horse, was really the calling card for the late 19th, early 20th century. There's this period where people are crazy for monuments, where this was, it was a period that people in the time, contemporaries at the time, called monument mania, because people were sort of criticizing this as, why do we have so many monuments? Why is everybody so crazy to put these up everywhere in in front of government buildings, in city squares? They started to get to the point where people thought, well, these aren't as effectual in what they were supposed to do. And so the question is, what were they supposed to do? And you're still asking this question, is why did they have them? But in the late 19th, early 20th century, places all over the world were doing this. Europe, Latin America, the US, putting up statues of people that were supposed to represent our values. They were ideas. During Monument Mania, why were they all doing this? People were rushing to put up monuments to national heroes or ideals. Because in the 19th century, you see a lot of places that are going through turmoil. The US is one, the Civil War. In Europe, for example, the French Revolution in the late 18th century, of course, explodes, and then there's a long period of revolutionaries trying to figure out how to define the country. Who are they? And how do we move forward from here? And so in 1875, after the establishment of the Third Republic in France, patriots start to commission dozens of statues of this allegory named Marianne. And so she is this allegory of liberty, equality, and fraternity, the ideals behind the French Revolution. And so you see lots of statues of her in France, late 19th century. Latin America, you see a lot of countries in Latin America, most Latin American countries achieve independence in the early 1800s, and then start to go through all these periods of turmoil, basically over how do we govern these new nations? Who are we? And how do we go forward from here? And you have different political factions arguing over what the path is forward. By the late 19th century, there's movements towards unity. Places like Argentina, Mexico, Chile, Peru, officials are starting to, they start putting up monuments. Who are we? These define our ideals and our values moving forward. So monuments were understood in the in this period where we see the Columbus statues. A lot of those come in the early 20th century, same with Confederate monuments. Monuments were understood, very clearly understood, as a way to project values in public spaces. They were about giving examples literally on a pedestal, right? So you look up at it and the viewer is sort of separated from this deified figure above. And this is a figure that represents patriotism, virtue, valor, all of those things. And so you see a big push towards this exaltation of the individual. The individual represents us. You see that start to change through the 20th century, but these classical style monuments with a figure on a pedestal, they are very much an older style of thinking. And so that's kind of what you're seeing with the questioning of these now is monuments really, the calls that they're erasing history, most monuments created in this period, they're not about history. They're about creating a vision of the past and of the future. Who are we?
Okay.
Right? And so for the French Revolution, that's Marianne, the allegory of liberty and equality and fraternity. For Latin America, it was for whatever country, there's a bunch of different examples, and of what they believe themselves to be. And so there's also this idea that, this firm belief that citizens in these new republics needed to see those examples in their everyday landscapes.
Okay.
Yeah, so we start to get into this idea of the power of public space, as people very much understood this, is that if you see this in your everyday landscapes, it will be impactful. This is the example that you want to live up to. And so the questions that we're looking at now is, are are Confederates something that we as a nation, does it represent our values as a nation, or Columbus?
Sure.
So,
And I like that you had brought up the argument that we're seeing over and over again, that us taking down these statues, that we're erasing history, but that's not what they were even meant for.
right, is that the truth is that most monuments, particularly in this period that you see, late 19th, early 20th century, right up into the mid 20th century, the idea of these was not about the past, it was about a vision for the future. And so for Confederate monuments, those in particular were a vision of white supremacy, of continuing what the Confederate cause was, which cannot be divorced from continuing slavery. Is that the Confederate monuments were, you can tell so much about timing. Historians were all about context. You have to look at when these monuments go up. And if you look at when they go up, they don't go up right after the Civil War. They go up, most of them go up between 1900 and 1920, which directly coincides with implementation of Jim Crow segregation laws in the South. And so it's not about what the Civil War was about, which was slavery. The Confederacy lost. Their idea was to maintain slavery. The lost cause narrative, as it's known, is what these monuments projected, is that, that there was valor in the Confederacy, and it wasn't about slavery. It was about, protecting Southern heritage against a Northern aggressor. And so Confederate monuments in particular, it's really interesting. You look at this from a global perspective, because you can see what was France trying to say, what was England trying to say, and there's people all over in countries everywhere that are saying, this is crazy. Why do we have so many monuments? Why are so everybody obsessed with this? Because it was seen as a clear way to project values and define identity. Okay. And so what do Confederate monuments tell us about the identity that what was that? It's not about the history, actually. It's about a vision for the future and who, a white supremacist vision in this case.
Sure. And would there be like an argument at all that, since that was such a, part of the South, that is taking these down kind of, might hurt their identity? I mean, I'm not saying that in a way that it would be, it's at all good what they stood for or anything, but, the South just has such that identity, and they pride themselves for that.
Well, because the lost cause, in so many senses, it worked, right? Is that, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, beginning in the early 1900s, or actually even in the late 1800s, I should say, most Confederate monuments go up from 1890 to even up to 1950. And so there's a concerted effort to rewrite the Civil War into this lost cause narrative, is that after the Civil War, Southerners are devastated. They lose the war, they lose what they see as their way of life. Their way of life includes chattel slavery. There's really, the lost cause really is powerful. It carries a lot of weight. It is tied to identity, right? And this was part of that was what it was intended to do, is to divorce the issue of slavery from the Civil War and sort of make it about a vague idea of Southern heritage. But if you look at, we historians, we always look at documents. The thing is that monuments are a really flawed way to understand history. It's a very minimal venue. It doesn't tell a complex story. History is complex, people are complex. And so the monument really only tells this celebratory narrative. It's very important for us to remember history. Southerners can certainly remember their past. We can remember it too. It's important that we do, but we don't have to venerate it. And so the monument is about commemorating it, venerating a past that, again, like I said before, is monuments are so much more about values than they are about history. And so do those, this is sort of a reckoning, right? Is that even for those in the South, do the values represented in those monuments represent them now? Is that, I think that was a very long way to answer your question, but I think
that was a good way.
I think that that's a very difficult question, right? Is that there is an emotional connection to that lost cause narrative, because it's painful. We have painful pasts in the United States, a lot of countries do, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't confront them.
Sure.
Actually, it's very important that we confront them and we learn from them rather than venerate them.
I think what
It was a progressive white idea that stems from a white idea that we're a superior civilization, that we're going to educate Ojibwe people in the ways of the white man. So we send them to school to be, we take children from homes. A lot of people think that the boarding schools were for orphans. They weren't. They took kids out of homes with moms and dads and sent them to the reservation, sometimes as early as 6 years old, or sent them to boarding schools and taught them domestic arts like sewing or agricultural arts, farming. They're trying to make Ojibwe people assimilate them into white society. And so that lasted well into the 20th century. And part of the purpose, the stated U.S. government purpose, was to break the chains of Ojibwe culture. So if we take away their language, if we take away their way of living, then they'll assimilate into white culture, and Ojibwe culture won't be around anymore. So one of the people who ran a big boarding school out east, his phrase was, "You have to kill the Indian to save the man." So you have to kill what's Indian inside of him in order to save the white person, which would then flower, right? And so that's a thing. And then during the 1880s and 1890s also, the land on the reservation was given to individual families, and they thought that would break down tribal ties. So if you were an individual landowner, then you wouldn't have so many ties to your community. You'd have more ties to your own land. That land then was given to people, but they didn't have the capacity to survive. They didn't have access to capital, so a lot of them ended up selling that land to, and that's how the tourist industry developed in northern Wisconsin, up on those reservations. So probably 80% of the land at Lac Flambeau was alienated from the Indian people and sold to white people. So most of the reservation went out of Indian hands. There was a little respite in the 30s with Indian New Deal, so-called, under Roosevelt. But by the 40s and 50s, things had really grown dire. There wasn't jobs, there wasn't access to capital. In 1922, Le Coudray was flooded, a dam was built, and a lot of the reservation was flooded by the Northern States Power Company in order to direct flow of water down here for electrical generation. And so they lost the capacity to raise 25,000 pounds of wild rice every year. So from 25,000 pounds a year for the community to zero right there in the 1920s. So by the 40s and 50s, the situation had really grown dire on the reservations. And one of the things that's helped bring it back is relief in the courts and our changing ideas of Indian sovereignty, and that Indian people should control their own destiny. And as we've kind of moved into that era, then I think things have gotten better, definitely on the reservations, because they have self-determination, they have more access to capital, they have economic engines, and it's easier to make your way, as everybody in America knows, when you have those things.
Right. And so then what was happening in the 70s and 80s here in the 1970s and 1980s with the Ojibwe people?
Well, one of the parts of the treaties, the 1837 treaty and the 1854 treaty, and I think the 1842 treaty, although I don't know as much about that one, is that, and this is oversimplifying, but the land which had been under the territorial control of Britain and then the United States, Indian people, including Lake Superior Ojibwe people, had access to use their land. And in order to transfer the use of the land from Ojibwe people to white settlers, those treaties were signed, which gave white settlers the right to use the land. But Lake Superior Ojibwa reserved the rights to hunt, fish, and gather on any part of that ceded territory, which ran from the Eau Claire River clear on up to Lake Superior. Now that would be a really fundamental misunderstanding in the 1970s because they finally asserted their right. So two brothers who were college students, Mike and Fred Tribble, who were LCO tribal members, they'd been in a class learning about treaties, and it occurred to them that they had rights under the treaties that had never been given up, and one of those rights was to fish and anywhere in the ceded territory. So they called the game warden, this is about 1974, they called the game warden and said, say, we're going to push our ice fishing rig off of the reservation, we're going to go fishing, so if you'd like to come out and arrest us, that'd be just fine. And so the game warden did. Came out and arrested them, and that went clear all the way to the I think it's the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and it was decided in the brothers' favor that they could fish anywhere in the ceded territory. So it was a long court case, and certainly a great college education, right? And then, as the years progressed, more and more cases, some of them which went all the way to the Supreme Court, and some of them came from Minnesota, some from Wisconsin, established more parameters for those treaty rights. That here's the way those treaties were signed back in the 1800s, and here's what they mean today. But the state of Wisconsin, the DNR, the schools, gaslighted the white public about these laws. That's true. That's a true story. And so the people who lived then in northern Wisconsin and Minocqua and all these other places didn't understand that these were rights that the Ojibwa people always had, not rights that they were given specially by the DNR, by the state of Wisconsin. And so they were, I mean, understandably anxious about that, agitated and angry, because they thought that the Ojibwa people had rights that white people didn't have. Well, those rights they'd always had, but never given away. I think if that had been understood, it would have changed the conversation. So then there were huge protests. I mean, protests with hundreds, thousands of people, protests that made the national news. And so angry people showing up at the boat landings with signs and posters and placards, none of which I can repeat on the air for your viewers. Really racist, ugly, violent confrontations, and white people throwing rocks at boats and terrorizing Ojibwa people for asserting the rights that they'd always had. The contention was that this will gut northern Wisconsin of deer. There won't be any deer left because all Ojibwa people will be harvesting the deer. That there won't be any fish, there won't be any game fish left because they'll be all harvested by spear rather than fished with a rod and reel by sport fishermen, the way white people should be doing it. As it turned out, the largest catch, I think, ever in northern Wisconsin by tribal members was about 4% of the sport fish total population. So 96% were taken by white sport fishermen. Well, once statistics like that got published, then the sort of that idea that this was all about sport fishing and tourism, that kind of fell away.
Sure.
And I think exposed the kind of racist roots of that conflict.
When people of color were just the ones asking for the monuments to come down, the government's easily ignored us. White people came in and pulled those things down. And the question is, why did it take that? Why couldn't they listen to us? You have to have the white allies before they pay attention to you. That is the sad part of it. It wasn't enough for black people to say no. It wasn't enough for indigenous people to say no. There had to be white allies there saying, well, they're right, for this to be taken seriously.
And so, again, you think that right now, the protests that we're seeing, and the conversations now, we're sitting down, we're having this conversation, you're teaching me a lot about things that I, didn't know or haven't experienced. Is this how we're going to change the system?
We changed the system one conversation at a time, one person at a time. Instead of thinking of racism, think of a racial performance. We perform race. And the way to break up that performance are these individual discussions. The way to break up that unconscious bias is meeting people, working with people, and seeing that they are not the stereotypes. And it's not going to work for everyone. I'm going to be honest. There are some people who are hard-headed, and they're never going to let it go because this is what they need to get by. They have nothing else. But for the majority of us, contact across race, contact across class, contact across gender is what allows us to individualize people and to stop stereotyping. Everyone has biases. We're all stereotyped. We all stereotype people. But the difference is not the biases, it's the behavior. The difference between individual racism is the individual, we like to think racism is the individual screaming, I hate X group, I'm going to kill X group, and then it's a noose. But what really creates havoc are the people who are not prejudiced, but they see rules that have disparate impacts. They see rules that undermine one group, that disadvantage one group, and they don't change those rules. They recognize that these things may look neutral on their face, but they're not neutral. If you're a poor white and the only way to get access to a program is through a very expensive computer program you don't get to have, that's a disparate impact, and that disadvantages you. So it looks neutral on its face, but it's not neutral. So right now we're struggling with the combination of the people who are just overtly racist. And they are. And I don't know why they are overtly racist. Well, I do. They're overtly racist, and they always end it with, but I'm not racist, because they think all whites are racist. And they think that by saying, but I'm not racist, they somehow absolve this act of power, and they remove the ability of others to see that, yeah, it is a racist act. You know, I don't like black people, but I'm not racist. No, you are. We're not even going to play that semantical game. And that's what it is. They're using things in a contradictory way to try to confuse you and gaslight you. You know, we struggle with them. We struggle with the covert racists who really hate people, but they're not going to tell. So they're just going to mess with you. If you've been to middle school, you know these people. Everybody who's been to middle school knows the undercover bullies. So the overt are the above ground bullies. The covert are the undercover bullies. And then the implicit bias are the people who are clueless, and they help the other two bullies. What you want is to not be in any of those three categories. Because I guarantee if they are prejudiced against race, they're also prejudiced against gender, they're also prejudiced against class. And when you remove all the multicultural people from the place, they will go find some white people to scapegoat. Because they need scapegoats in order to feel powerful. So it's not, the reason why they scapegoat people of color is because we're there and it's convenient. They'll scapegoat somebody whose parents are divorced. They'll scapegoat somebody who's poor. But the ways in which we allow and excuse this racialized scapegoating and this racialized bullying tend to be more pervasive, and people tend to be more disingenuous about handling it. But a bully always tries to say they're not a bully. This provocative bullies, these people who try to provoke anger and bad behavior, they've always been with us.
I really like that analogy. It's like the bullies in middle school. You know, everyone can think they know those three types of people. You know, I can think of their names in my head right now. So it's a good, a good way to really, group that and to see, okay, yes, I can see where those, where those actions are, and, those words too that people use.
And just like bullies, bullies are a catch-22. The only thing that really stops a middle school bully is to lay them out, right? You have to hit them. But if you hit them, who gets in trouble? What is the price you have to pay in order to end bullying? And there's always going to be a couple of adults who don't want to, they're disinterested, they don't care, so they're not going to pay attention, they don't want to know who started it. So they punish everybody. Then there's the people who know the bullies are little you-know-whats, and they're like, hit them and we won't watch. And then there's the ones who see it's bullying and they stop it and they give consequences. We need to give consequences, you know, because bullying happens because there is no consequence because it works. And right now we have empowered these bullies in multiple walks of life to try to destroy our civic life. Now, the school system's not going to like what I just said because I also believe that means zero tolerance needs to end. If a gay kid is getting bullied by somebody and lays that person out, self-defense is a thing to me. I believe in self-defense. And I think we need to have a good, hard talk about why we punish certain groups, and especially black people, for engaging in self-defense.
And it wasn't, relatively that long ago where it was illegal for someone who looked like me to learn how to read or write. So I think the part about social justice that we're dealing with right now is the ability to be able to take all of this energy and harness it into really doing something good, changing who we are, changing the structures and knocking them down. In education, it is very important that we understand that this institution is historically one of the more racist institutions we have in this country, in terms of the history that we teach, in terms of what we acknowledge happening, in terms of the fact that this is really a melting pot for all different cultures to come to, and we teach that. We teach the classroom things, but we don't spend as a system, as a society, talking enough about those things that happen outside of the classroom that really impact our growth and development. I always tell people I am fortunate to have a job where I get to talk about the things that most people run from. Most people don't like to talk about race. Most people don't like to talk about gender discrimination, but it's those kinds of things that can really push us toward being a better society. And I am happy that the peaceful demonstrations that are going on across society now are really pushing us and forcing us to change the way we do business. I think a lot of us have just gotten complacent, and the time for words is done. People are demanding action. We know what they're asking for. We know what they need. So it's simply time for us to start doing it.